The man known to history as Matthew Hopkins, who would famously become known as the Witchfinder General, was born in Great Wenham, in Suffolk, in England, around the year 1620. He cannot have been born before 1619, as a document in which his father was bequeathed a Bible by a deceased parishioner from that year lists Matthew's father's living sons at that time, and Matthew is not listed amongst them. Matthew's father was James Hopkins. James served as the vicar of St. John's Church in Wenham. His will, which was validated in 1634, lists him as having 6 children, but names only 2, Thomas and James, and it seems likely they were the elder children and adults by 1634. The will conversely assigned the care of the remaining 4 children to his widow, which is in line with Matthew still being a minor at that time. This also indicates that Matthew was almost certainly in his mid-20s during his active years as Witchfinder General from 1645 to 1647. There is no indication of what Matthew's mother's name was, though it is clear that she gave birth to and raised numerous children, while it seems plausible, given the high infant mortality rates at the time, that 1 or 2 of her children would not have survived into their adult years, on top of the 6 that seemingly did. From amongst these siblings, we know that Matthew's brother, John, became the minister of Southambridge near Rochford in 1645, but was removed in 1646, apparently for the neglect of his work. Aside from these details concerning Matthew's family, we have practically no information about Hopkins' early life, though we can conjecture at what sort of life he would have led in the small settlement of Wenham. Even today, the village, which lies between Colchester and Ipswich, has a population of less than 200 people. Life would have been characterized by a blend of agricultural work, community interdependence, religious observance, and concern about illness, disease, and injury, with some limited proto-industrial activity in the form of cloth working, smithing, and the like. Most villagers would spend their time farming, with common crops including wheat, barley, oats, and rye. Livestock such as sheep, cows, pigs, and chickens were also vital for sustenance and trade. Homes were basic and would be cold and damp in the winter and stifling in the summer months. The plague and other diseases were endemic in England, meaning that periodic outbreaks were common. Communities were close, and the threats facing early modern villages numerous. It was into this world that Matthew Hopkins was born and raised. In the absence of any further information about his youth, we can only assume that he remained in communities with this sort of lifestyle and economy until further records show his activities as a witch hunter many years later. He does not appear as a student on any existing matriculation list for an English educational institution, though he later claimed to have acquired some legal training in the Netherlands in his youth, and many people who worked in the courts in early modern times were not fully trained lawyers, but more like clerks with informal experience of the courts. The fame of Matthew Hopkins stems almost entirely from the final 3 years of his life, between 1644 and 1647, when he became infamous for his onslaught against those who he claimed were engaged in witchcraft in England. Thus, in the absence of any major details concerning his life up to his mid-20s, we should reflect on the nature of the society he lived in and the place of witchcraft and witch hunting within it, as these are critical to Matthew's story. By the time of Hopkins' birth around 1620, England and Europe as a whole was in the midst of a period of substantial economic, social and cultural growth, such that the period of the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries are often referred to as the early modern period, a necessary bridge between the medieval world to the modern world of the 19th and 20th centuries, as science and rationality began to expand and prevail. Yet there were contradictions within this world too. Despite the growing drive towards reason and science, the century and a half after the inception of the Protestant Reformation in 1517 saw a series of unrelenting and savage civil wars and wars of religion across the continent between Roman Catholics and various Protestant denominations. The bloodiest of all began just a few short years before Hopkins was born. This was the 30 Years' War, which ravaged Germany between 1618 and 1648 and highlighted how a world in which rationality and reason were seemingly expanding was also one of religious dogma and immense violence at the same time. Another element of this paradoxical dichotomy between an age of reason and an age of superstition and crude religious beliefs, one which would be completely central to Matthew Hopkins' story, was the growing belief in the prevalence of witchcraft and malevolent forces in European society. Contrary to how it is perceived today, the belief in witches and the craze for hunting down witches was not actually a medieval phenomenon, but rather an early modern one. In fact, several popes had issued papal bulls or directives between the 10th and 13th centuries decreeing that the belief in witches was not grounded in biblical theology, and that if communities suspected someone in their midst of being a witch, they should not jump to conclusions and instead refer the matter to their local priest or bishop. What changed matters was a series of crises in the 14th century, notably the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and then the arrival of the bubonic plague to Europe 3 decades later. The Black Death devastated Europe from 1346 onwards, killing roughly 1 in 3 Europeans by the end of the 1350s. As these miseries were visited on the continent, there was a major spike in the persecution of groups which were perceived to be on the fringes of society, notably Jewish communities, and also individuals who were social outsiders and were now accused in ever-growing numbers of witchcraft. This built slowly, and the European witch hunts could be perceived as running from the 1350s to the 1710s, encompassing the late medieval and early modern periods, but the peak of the witch hunts came between the 1580s and the 1650s. Hundreds of thousands of people would be accused across this period, and upwards of 70,000 or 80,000 would ultimately be killed, though the figures are disputed and may be considerably higher. Some countries experienced greater levels of persecution than others. The witch hunts were most intense in Germany and Switzerland, while within Britain there was a particularly intense witch craze in Scotland. England's witch craze was comparatively smaller, which makes the story of Matthew Hopkins, as we will soon see, especially unusual. One of the most popular core beliefs surrounding witches was that they had formed a pact between themselves and the devil, often at a gathering called a Sabbath. This term was not generally used at the time, and influential writings on witchcraft, such as the Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1486 by the Dominican Heinrich Kramer, refer to assemblies instead. However, the idea of the gathering as an affront to a religious ceremony gained currency in popular culture in the later early modern period, hence the modern term. The Sabbath was thought of as a gathering of witches and potential witches at night in some lone and remote location. 3 core components formed the event: humans, witches who had travelled by some means, including flying broomsticks, the devil, and a procession of the undead. Paintings depicting the scene were produced since early modern times by artists such as Francisco Goya, Franz Franken the Younger, and Émile Bayard. It was at these gatherings that, in the view of popular society and witch hunters of the kind Matthew Hopkins briefly became, the first crimes were committed by the accused. Deviant sexuality is a constant theme advanced in texts such as the Malleus, which suggested that, if the woman in question did not physically travel to the location of the Sabbath, she could induce a hallucination by means of a flying ointment, a hallucinogen absorbed through the skin. Records suggest that this was applied through an act of erotic self-pleasure, with ointment applied first to a broom handle, which was then used as an object of self-stimulation. One record, detailing the trial of one Alice Keiteler, bears the passage, quote, "In rifling the closet of the lady, Alice Keiteler, they found a pipe of ointment wherewith she greased a staff, upon which she ambled and galloped through thick and thin, when and in what manner she listed." This is all suggestive of sexual deviancy in the minds of early modern people, and would sometimes be accompanied by an accusation that the woman in question had performed sexual acts with the devil himself, through which a person was supposedly recruited to be his agent on earth in the form of a witch. It was with this, the covenant formed between a witch and the devil, that Hopkins and his associates would concern themselves. The basis for an accusation of witchcraft was usually quite flimsy, though we do get cases where there does seem to have been a bizarre sequence of events which individuals at the time could only explain away through some supernatural act. Both men and women were tried for witchcraft during the early modern period, but it was overwhelmingly women who made up the ranks of those forced into the dock, often having endured hours of torture and interrogation. Over 80% of all those who were accused of witchcraft were women. There was a common trend amongst the accused, namely that they were women who lived alone in a household without a male head. This meant that widows who had not had children or suffered miscarriages or the death of their children in infancy, or spinsters who had never married, were the most common targets of witchcraft accusations. In such close-knit communities, such women often did not live in the same manner as other people. Left to fend for themselves, the roles in the community often assigned to women in nuclear households could not be performed by widows and spinsters living alone in this way. Similarly, many of the men who found themselves accused of witchcraft were often unmarried or were individuals who were considered to be eccentric or social outsiders. When an accusation came forth against such people from a suspicious third party, many of the accused had little recourse to funds and friends to help in their defense. Those who appeared before the court were some of the most vulnerable in a community, and they often stood accused of crimes it was almost impossible to defend themselves against. While the scale of the witch hunts in England was relatively limited, there were unique aspects to it which would influence the manner in which Matthew Hopkins carried out his work in the mid-1640s. For instance, witchcraft had been formally criminalised through the Witchcraft Act in one of the parliaments of King Henry VIII in 1542. The Act was repealed in 1547 following the accession of King Edward VI, but it was reintroduced in 1562, not long after Queen Elizabeth I came to the throne, and so witchcraft was punishable by death in England in the late 16th and 17th centuries. This meant that, unlike some other European countries, in England, witchcraft was considered a criminal rather than exclusively religious offence. Because of this, witches tried after this period were not burned alive, contrary to much popular belief, but hanged. Burning at the stake was a particularly nasty method of execution reserved in England for heretics, but as witches were tried in civil rather than ecclesiastical courts, they were legally regarded as criminals rather than heretics. In the late 16th century, laws were reformed to allow witches to be tried and sentenced to death in local courts. That witchcraft was criminalized by the state is an indication of how serious a crime it was considered to be. Ecclesiastical courts had, over the early modern period, waned in their influence in the legal landscape of England, and their powers, as well as the cases they considered, grew less significant. The passing of a law against witchcraft, making it an offence which could be tried by the state rather than the church, suggests that this was a crime considered by the prevailing authorities in the 1540s to be serious, potent, and real. There were specific events which were occurring in England both shortly before Hopkins was born and during his lifetime, which led to an intensification of sentiment concerning witchcraft there in the middle of the 17th century. Firstly, in 1603, King James VI of Scotland had succeeded Queen Elizabeth I to become King James I of England and Ireland and VI of Scotland. We have already seen that the witch craze was considerably more intense in Scotland than it was in England. The succession of a Scottish monarch to the English throne and the arrival of Scottish nobles and courtiers to London from 1603 onwards saw a transplantation of Scottish attitudes towards witchcraft to England. Indeed, the new king was himself a student of witchcraft. In 1597, 6 years before he succeeded Elizabeth in England, James had published a book in Scotland entitled Demonology. His interest in the subject was sparked when a woman who was accused of witchcraft in Scotland had stated at her trial that Satan had spoken to her and proclaimed that King James was his greatest mortal enemy on earth. Upon hearing that his name had been mentioned during the trial of this accused woman, James demanded that she be brought before him at the royal court so that she could repeat her testimony in person. In light of his firm Protestantism, James was doubtlessly pleased at being named Satan's greatest threat and arch foe in the mortal realm. Indeed, the king was so eager to hunt witches thereafter that he produced Demonology. This work was to become influential in heightening concern and fear around witches in Scotland and later England, and was essential reading for people like Matthew Hopkins during the 17th century. In Demonology, James endorsed the practice of witch hunting and outlined the pact that was allegedly formed between the devil and those who practiced witchcraft. Witches, according to this idea, were men and women who had relinquished all Christianity in favor of forming an agreement with the devil so that, in return for supernatural powers, they would act as his servants on earth. Witches were insidious, living inside the community and acting as a sort of cancer that threatened the lives, well-being and livelihood of all earnest Christians. One final element of the political, social and religious background in which Hopkins lived and worked merits attention. By the late 1630s, there were growing tensions across the realms of King Charles I, the son and heir of King James, as to how Charles was governing England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. In Scotland, the broad political and religious community was opposed to James's efforts to enforce Episcopalianism. The idea that bishops should be appointed to govern the Scottish Kirk, or church, in the country, where Presbyterianism, a decentralized form of Protestantism in which presbyters, or community elders, governed the church in each locality. This eventually spilled over into a war between the Crown and Charles's Scottish subjects in the later 1630s and early 1640s. When the Scots invaded northern England, the English Parliament attempted to exploit the situation to extract economic, political and religious concessions from Charles in return for their financial and military support against the Scots. This would eventually boil over into civil war in England in 1642. By then, Charles I's Irish subjects had also rebelled and had taken control of vast swathes of the country. These wars would rage on through the 1640s and into the early 1650s, eventually leading to the trial and execution of King Charles in 1649 and the creation of an English Republic, or Commonwealth. This febrile atmosphere was ripe for the development of suspicion, fear, and concern. The English civil wars were, proportionately, one of the deadliest conflicts ever witnessed by the English. It is estimated that 4% of the total population died as a result of the conflict and its effects. Every family, every village, and every town was affected and blighted by the wars, which manifested not only in death on the battlefield, but by the division of counties, communities, and the devastation of the population by famine, the enforced billeting of soldiers on communities, and the collapse of vast swathes of local and national trade. Coupled with this was an environment in which malaria, the plague, and other deadly diseases were endemic, killing thousands every year in agonizing circumstances and without remedy. An explanation for the pain, suffering, and turmoil, much of it seemingly unexplained and misunderstood, was at the forefront of the minds of much of the English population, and many people turned to the supernatural in their angst, scapegoating outsiders in their communities as witches who were bringing this calamity down upon them. Into this atmosphere walked Matthew Hopkins in the mid-1640s. This lengthy preamble describing the nature of witchcraft and the witch hunts in early modern Europe and England in particular is vital to understanding Matthew Hopkins' story. Beyond the previously related brief details of his family background, the next substantial records that exist that mention Hopkins were not produced until 1644. All we know of the interim period is that he probably spent some of his late teens or early 20s living in the Dutch Republic, where he claimed to have received some legal training as well as working as a mariner for a time. His legal training no doubt aided his later work in bringing witches to trial, while his time spent at sea amongst seamen, a community who were notoriously superstitious and favoured astrological studies as a way of determining when was a lucky time to sail and so forth, doubtlessly informed his worldview in later years. The later records indicate that Hopkins had come to live in Manningtree in the county of Essex by 1644, on what is now the northernmost edge of the county, located next to an estuary. Hopkins had evidently been relatively successful in the intervening period since we last heard mention of him as a child, having purchased the Thorn Inn in nearby Mistley. It was at this juncture that, by his own account, he became concerned by a group of women living in the town. He began to fear that they were witches, those who had formed a pact with the devil in order to gain supernatural powers and had foregone their godly obligations as normal human beings. These initial investigations soon led to an alleged net of wider witches in Essex being discovered, one in which Elizabeth Clark was central. She was an obvious target for such accusations, as her mother had been found guilty of witchcraft many years earlier. Clark was accused by Hopkins of cursing the wife of the tailor of Manningtree, John Rivet, during the winter of 1643 and into 1644. His accusations soon led to a witch trial. As Hopkins was prohibited from extracting a confession under torture, he instead elected to engage in psychological torture, ensuring that Clark was sleep-deprived for days until she confessed to summoning familiars, the name at that time for animal forms of the devil, and cursing members of the local community. In the end, Clark was found guilty of witchcraft at the Chelmsford Assize trials and hanged, while dozens of others implicated in this alleged net of witches were imprisoned or suffered other punishments. It was the beginning of Hopkins' reign of terror. Much of the limited information we have concerning Hopkins and his views on both witchcraft and its place in English society during the crisis of the Civil Wars comes from a short treatise or pamphlet book which he produced and published in 1647. This was entitled The Discovery of Witches, or, to give it its full, rather cumbersome title, The Discovery of Witches in Answer to Several Queries lately delivered to the Judges of Assize for the County of Norfolk and now published by Matthew Hopkins for the benefit of the whole kingdom. An idea of the kind of text Hopkins produced and his intention of publishing it was provided in the biblical quote which Hopkins placed on the cover. This came from the book of Exodus and stated, quote, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." The text is a relatively brief one, small by comparison with its historical importance for the history of witchcraft in early modern England. It consists of 14 queries, with answers thereto on a wide range of matters relating to the identification, questioning, and punishment of witches. Hopkins also included some extra biographical information in it, as well as his methods and theories on witchcraft. Thus, cumulatively, it provides us with answers to a wide range of questions about Hopkins' activities and is the main primary source associated with understanding his actions, motives, techniques, and intention. Hopkins elaborated on his first encounter with witches in Essex in the 4th query of The Discovery of Witches. Here, he described a scene in Manningtree where every 6 weeks on a Friday night, 7 or 8 women from the town allegedly met a little way outside the collection of houses that constituted the village in order to offer solemn sacrifices to the devil. One woman, involved in these Sabbath rituals, was overheard speaking to her imps, a term used to describe a sort of demon. The witch in question commanded her imps to meet with another member of her coven, who was subsequently apprehended. Women from the town searched the accused and found her to have several witches' marks, including an alleged third nipple, which, quote, "honest women have not." This use of birthmarks and other physical traits as proof of the guilt of a witch was common. With the witch thus identified, Hopkins then claims that the local magistrate ordered that the woman be deprived of sleep for 3 or 4 days in order to extract confessions and also to force their familiars, or demon animals, to appear, something which would provide clear evidence that she was, in fact, a witch. This description of events in Manningtree at the beginning of his work as a witch hunter provides a good insight into how Hopkins operated, and indeed how witch hunts as a whole played out in early modern Europe. The methods used by Hopkins to interrogate the accused in Manningtree would be employed by him elsewhere in the years that followed. They remain one of the most controversial elements of his activities. Suspects could be subjected to what was called the swimming test. This was based on the belief that, since witches had renounced their baptism, holy water would reject them. The accused would thus be dunked into water, with the argument being that those who were guilty would survive. Those who drowned were therefore shown not to be witches after all. The only problem was that if they were innocent, they often drowned to death during questioning. The accused could also be cut with a blunt knife, the belief supposedly being that if they did not bleed, then they had the mark of the devil upon them. Hopkins replied to critics of the swimming test that the evil and cruelty of the devil was not suspended, even for his followers. The devil would promise his witches that the swimming test would not kill them, that they would be safe when ducked underwater and survive. This was yet another example of his treacheries. The devil did not step in to protect the witches, and they drowned. To Hopkins, even those who drowned could be witches who had fallen foul of the devil's deceit. Another way to extract specific confessions was, as we have seen in the Manningtree instance, through sleep deprivation. The accused would be kept awake by Hopkins for days on end, leading them to enter a mental state where the line between reality and hallucination was blurred. The women subjected to this practice would become so exhausted that they would believe that dreams were in fact true and often formed the basis of many confessions. This latter point was particularly valuable for Hopkins and his associates. Although the popular perception today is of witches simply being lynched without due process by local communities, in reality, those who were accused of witchcraft had the right to a trial and due process. Legally, to find a person guilty of witchcraft, a confession had to be extracted from the accused person themselves. Thus, Hopkins was operating in the mid-1640s as Witchfinder General within a legal framework. But, in reality, the confessions he acquired were generally obtained under torture, which is not a reliable method of extracting accurate confessions. The quote-unquote evidence collected from the first witch Hopkins questioned in Manningtree was used as the basis for the start of a wider witch hunt in Essex by Hopkins in 1644. Women, often under torture and duress, gave the name of other members of the community who they claimed had also sold their souls to the devil during Sabbath meetings. This created a domino effect where a greater and greater number of women were indicted for the crime of witchcraft, something that was common in witch hunts all across early modern Europe. Eventually, as these investigations expanded outwards, dozens of people were arrested, questioned, and scheduled for trial. Such were the harsh methods employed by Hopkins that before the case even came to trial in the town of Chelmsford in the summer of 1645, 4 were already dead. 25 were sent to trial, and eventually over half of these were found guilty and hanged. In the Discovery of Witches, Hopkins concluded the segment discussing this initial hunt in Essex by suggesting that the devil was sent in the form of a bear to kill him for his actions in hunting down these witches in his local community, and that this experience inspired him to become a professional witch hunter. This provenance makes the methods of interrogation used by Matthew Hopkins and his band even more insidious. Women, pushed to the point of hallucination by sleep deprivation and psychological torture, were faced with accusations of witchcraft not on the grounds of what they had done, but rather what they had often thought or imagined. A strange dream had years before, which involved anything remotely resembling the Sabbath or animals, could be evidence that a witch had hallucinated she was with the devil or summoning his familiars, actions considered just as grave as if she had attended the devil in person. Any birthmark or irregular patch of skin could suddenly become a telling witch's mark, and any out-of-the-ordinary recollection could be evidence that someone had abandoned God and formed a new covenant with Satan. The initial panic caused by Matthew Hopkins in his campaign of accusation in Manningtree spread into a wider set of accusations and trials. In neighbouring Suffolk, in the months that followed, over 100 alleged witches were identified, with at least 40 executed. 20 further women were executed in Norfolk. From 1644, the year of Hopkins' first recorded accusation of witchcraft, it appears that he claimed to have an official appointment from Parliament as the Witchfinder General, tasked with hunting down those who had sold their souls to the devil. There is no official record of this appointment, and it is more than likely that Hopkins simply claimed this mantle without any appointment at all. During the chaos of the civil wars, where there were overlapping jurisdictions between the royalists and the parliamentarians across England and Wales, it was possible for a person to make such a claim without it having any legal basis. It is notable in this regard that there was no official post of Witchfinder General under normal circumstances in early modern England until Hopkins seemingly invented it in 1645. Hopkins was a religious man, but his motives for pursuing witches, as we will see, are still debated. At any rate, his appetite for the chase could not be confined to Essex, and he started to travel to different parishes around East Anglia, searching for people who could be accused of witchcraft. He soon became infamous for his activities. His rigorous and often brutal methods of interrogation and trial were notable even in the 17th century. Hopkins formed an association with another witch-hunting enthusiast, John Sterne, a fellow resident of Manningtree, whom Hopkins appointed as his assistant during the hunts there in 1644 and 1645, and a group of women known as searchers, who examined the accused for witch marks. Hopkins and his band would soon travel from town to town, offering his services as a supposedly professional investigator who could demonstrate whether an accused person was, in fact, a witch. Though he later claimed that he was generally called to come to a community to investigate suspicious events there, in reality, Hopkins and his followers often came uninvited and then stoked concern about social outcasts and eccentrics in their midst. We gain an insight into how Hopkins' mind worked, and indeed how most people treated charges of witchcraft in early modern times, from a response he gave to a question on his methods. This related to the use of skin blemishes and moles to identify people as being marked through their association with the devil. Many people asked the obvious question: why were these signs of some satanic collaboration in witches when so many other people who were not accused of witchcraft also had skin marks of one kind or another? Hopkins responded that, in essence, he just knew by seeing one which were signs of witchcraft and which weren't. Hopkins made sure to precede this answer with a defense of his claim to great skill, experience and expertise in the field, and therefore evidently believed he had done a good job in convincing the reader of the Discovery of Witches that in matters of witch hunting he was a man who could be taken at his word. Despite this brief diversion to ask the reader just to trust him, he then answers in a different prose that one could identify a witch's mark in 3 ways. The mark would be in a strange place on the body, it would be numb to pain, and it would sometimes be surrounded by dry or irritated skin, a result of where imps had tried to remove the mark before it could be uncovered by Hopkins and his associates. From their initial work in Manningtree in Essex, Hopkins and his band travelled further afield, offering their investigative services to people living in nearby towns and villages. The extent to which people actively sought out Matthew Hopkins to help them with their concerns is unclear. It seems to be the case that, in many instances, Hopkins and his group muscled into ongoing dramas in local communities and then introduced the idea that the source of a problem could be witchcraft. News of this Witchfinder general spread through the land, and soon Hopkins, accompanied by his ever-present associate John Stern, visited towns and villages in Suffolk, Norfolk, Essex, Cambridgeshire and Huntingdonshire between 1645 and 1647, with a couple of cases being investigated in places as far away as Northamptonshire and Bedfordshire. During the Civil War, these regions came under the control of parliamentarian forces and were organised into an administrative district known as the Eastern Association, which represented those areas which largely bankrolled the parliamentary army. Indeed, the importance of the Eastern Association as a source of tax revenue was shown when the authorities in Ipswich introduced a special local tax rate on witch hunting. Such was the scale of the income that Hopkins was able to garner. It appears that Hopkins and Stern charged the towns they entered a flat rate for their services, which they claimed was to maintain their company along with 3 horses. The total charge mentioned by Hopkins per town was 20 shillings or £1 sterling, which is equivalent to thousands of pounds today. However, town records suggest that Hopkins was not entirely accurate in his claim to only charge towns £1 for his services. Records from the Suffolk town of Stowmarket, for instance, show that the town was charged £23, though what the extraordinary circumstances for such a charge might have been are unclear. As Hopkins, Stern and their other sometime employees moved from region to region, they adduced numerous different reasons for why their victims were engaged in witchcraft. In the 13th query of the Discovery of Witches, Hopkins outlines the sort of relationship which he believed witches had with the devil and the sort of powers that they gained from him once they had submitted themselves to his covenant. There is an attempt at a religious argument, with Hopkins suggesting that God suffered the devil to perform such evil in the world, allowing him to enter as an impostor through the agency of human beings, which in early modern times were witches. The deal made between the devil and his followers was, according to Hopkins, formal, following the same pattern and nature each and every time it was constituted. The devil would, at a Sabbath, held in some distant and remote place, maybe a moor or a heath, address the hopefuls who had gathered there and ask, quote, "What will you have me do for you, my dear and nearest children, covenanted and compacted with me in my hellish league, and sealed with your blood, my delicate firebrand darlings?" To this, the witches would answer that they wanted protection and security in return from Satan if they were to submit to him. First, the witch would be granted protection from discovery, to which the devil agreed to murder anyone who posed a threat or could raise the alarm. He would also ensure that no one stood in the way of the ambitions of the witch in question, allowing them a free path to whatever end they desired without interference from others. The key part of the contract was that Satan would act through the witch to effect these killings, whether through disease or murder, as a physical act. The devil would not work remotely, but would provide the witch with the knowledge and the power they needed to eliminate these threats, whereby she could be the instrument of murder herself. Any misfortune, famine, illness, the death of infants or accidents could all be taken as Satan acting through one who had formed a covenant with him to benefit their own ends. The agreement reached, the witch would then submit to Satan and all of his laws, mischief, and evil intention. This belief and claim that the person who had become a witch had done so by entering into a formal, almost legal contract with the devil in the full knowledge of his ambitions, intentions, and immorality, in return for power and favor with him, was central to the case which was to be made against them in court. Hopkins also argued in his writings that the supernatural influence in any malign event could be detected instantly by a judge or magistrate, pointing to the greater crime being committed, that the person had formed an agreement with Satan to undertake the earthly crime of which they had also been indicted. Hopkins' methods were controversial even in his own time. As he began to range around England in 1646, the clergyman John Gall preached against Hopkins from his pulpit in Great Staughton, Cambridgeshire. Gall also wrote a pamphlet entitled Select Cases of Conscience Touching Witches and Witchcraft, which directly addressed the methods used by Hopkins and Stern. He argued that the swimming test used by Hopkins was ridiculous, and that, more broadly, a greater evidential basis was needed before a charge of witchcraft could be substantiated and a serious punishment administered. The sort of evidence collected by Hopkins, under duress, and often after a bout of torture, was not considered by Gall to constitute sufficient evidence of witchcraft. This was not to say that Gall denied the existence or the malign influence of witchcraft. However, he decried the methods used by Hopkins and the sort of hype he generated to warrant his high fees. Indeed, whilst higher parliamentary authorities seemed relatively unconcerned about the Witchfinder General, assize judges at the Oyer and Terminer sessions did question both Hopkins and Stern about the methods they employed to gain a confession. Over the course of their questioning, it was even suggested by a judge that Hopkins and Stern might themselves be using witchcraft to try and extract these confessions. Another suggested, perhaps more calmly, that Hopkins was using, quote, unlawful courses of torture to extract this information. However, once the session resumed, both Hopkins and Stern had returned to their bases in Essex, meaning that these deliberations did not amount to anything beyond speculation. There was good reason to be suspicious of his actions. Hopkins' own writings demonstrate clearly how these tactics of sleep deprivation provided worthless evidence. His wording makes this plain. Of one such interrogation he wrote that, quote, on the fourth night without sleep, she, the woman apprehended in Manningtree, called in her imps by their several names, and told them what shapes a quarter of an hour before they came in, there being 10 of us in the room. He goes on to describe how, exhausted and deprived of sleep for 4 days straight, the accused woman eventually described 5 familiars who were her accomplices. A white kitling, probably a kitten, called Holt, a fat spaniel dog called Jamara, a greyhound called Vinegar Tom, a black rabbit called Sack and Sugar, and a polecat called News. Having identified these 5 familiars, the witch proceeded to name other witches and her various imps. Their names included Peckin the Crown, Grizzle, and Greedygut. Hopkins eagerly claimed in the next sentence of his pamphlet that, quote, no mortal could invent these names. To the reader today, these are quite plainly the confused and terrified thoughts of an exhausted, pursued, elderly woman being prompted to offer her evidence to incriminate herself after days of sleep deprivation. The scene is illustrated in the Discovery of Witches in a printed image, showing 2 women surrounded by their familiars thus named, with Hopkins watching on from the top of the scene. Hopkins was also sensible of the controversy which surrounded his use of the swimming test and sleep deprivation, and argued that keeping a witch awake brought her closer to her imps and familiars without regard to the effects of sleep deprivation itself, including hallucination. Indeed, the next few entries in Hopkins' pamphlet try and deal with questions over evidence and his use of torture. For instance, in the 10th query, it was stated that, quote, there hath been an abominable, inhumane, and unmerciful trial of these poor creatures by tying them and heaving them into the water, a trial not allowable by law or conscience, and I would fain know the reasons for that. This appears to present a well-reasoned self-criticism by Hopkins, but he then responded that, whilst it was true that many women had died as a result of the swimming test, it was important to understand how the devil thought and operated with witches. He made it so that witches would only confess under the kind of duress which inadvertently caused the deaths of some innocent people, but Hopkins argued that this was a necessary price in order to identify the servants of the devil. Another controversial feature of Hopkins' work was his legal right to act in the way that he did. He famously claimed that he had a mandate from Parliament to undertake his investigations as Witchfinder General, which would then provide evidence for use in what were called commissions of oyer and terminer, inquiries which were set up to deal with a specific set of crimes which were a particular problem in a specific area. Grand juries presided over oyer and terminer sessions in the localities, alongside a judge of the assizes or circuit courts. Coastal areas of England often hosted oyer and terminer commissions designed to place pirates and smugglers on trial. In East Anglia, Hopkins' activities led to a string of cases in which claims of witchcraft were made against members of the community for misfortune and upset. Parliamentary authorities were aware of what Hopkins and Sterne were doing and mentioned them as busy men in reports produced ahead of the commissioning of an oyer and terminer session at Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk. This seems to suggest that parliamentary authorities were, on the whole, bemused but indifferent about what Hopkins was up to. There were simply bigger fish for them to fry in relation to the wider civil war and the administration of the Eastern Association. Hopkins and Sterne provided evidence for use in the court, and they were, in this sense, a helpful aid to the judicial system, which parliamentary authorities were in the process of reconfiguring since they had come under new control in these regions. The often secretive activities of Hopkins, Sterne, and his female aides means that few records exist which demonstrate Hopkins' specific role in the many trials in which he was involved in East Anglia and other parts of England between 1645 and 1647. Court records, and particularly those made at oyer and terminer sessions, are incredibly brief. Many simply recall the sentence that was ultimately passed without reference to the specific evidence that was provided, while local records of this kind were kept in a particularly haphazard fashion during the civil wars of the 1640s, with others destroyed as a result of the unrest. All of this makes Hopkins a strange character for the historian to examine. There are no formal records which directly report his birth, and no records which show what he did prior to his emergence on the historical record in 1644, or how he lived. The only records we have of Hopkins relate to the final few years of his life, during which time he operated at the very centre of the largest and most intense witch hunt England had ever seen. Between 1645 and 1647, over 250 accusations of witchcraft were made in the region of East Anglia, leading to the death of possibly well over 100 people. It has been estimated from court records that the evidence collected by Hopkins, through his methods of torture and examination, was used in the trial of over 300 people, overwhelmingly women. This raises questions as to whether or not he had ulterior motives. Why Hopkins decided to embark on his career as a witch hunter remains unclear. The only record directly produced by Hopkins was the Discovery of Witches, which in itself is a short text and not an autobiographical one. Clearly, Hopkins was a religious man, and one living in a region of England which was a hotbed of Puritanism, the purest Protestant faith espoused by the parliamentarians in the civil wars. These religious quarrels of the 1640s would have spurred people in the communities Hopkins was visiting to be especially guarded about witchcraft at the time, although it does not, by itself, provide an adequate motive to spark the most intense witch hunt ever seen in England. More than likely, Hopkins was simply a businessman who identified a lucrative and largely unexploited niche in the market. Conditions for a witchfinder were perfect. Fear, suspicion, and tension were at an all-time high during the unrest of the 1640s. Religious sensibilities had been shaken and threatened, and the sort of women pursued by Hopkins and his band had little recourse to defend themselves, occupying a space in society which meant they would receive little love or support from their neighbours. Donning an official-looking outfit, claiming to have a government mandate as Witchfinder General, and playing on the innate fears which lay in the hearts and minds of many in East Anglia, Hopkins posed as a competent, trustworthy figure with the promise to ferret out any collaborators with the devil. During a time of such upheaval, communities were glad to pay for what he was selling. Hopkins closed his 1647 pamphlet by tackling accusations that he was some sort of con man who charged extortionate prices from his customers as a way of sustaining the cost of travelling for him and his associates. In response to an accusation that, quote, "all that the Witchfinder doth is to fleece the country of their money, and therefore rides and goes to towns to have employment, and promiseth them fair promises, and it may be doth nothing for it, and possesseth many men, that they have so many wizards and so many witches in their town, and so heartens them on to entertain him." Hopkins responded that he had never been to a town where he had either not been directly invited to come and attended to a specific concern or issue, or where the townspeople were not glad of the sight of him. He also claimed that he provided good value for money in the provision of his services, making the claim that he would ride for days on end, apprehend several witches, and only ever charged 20 shillings a town, with this also covering the expenses of Sterne and their other staff. This, as we know from the example of Stowmarket, where he charged a rate of £23, was not always the case, and Hopkins also simply showed up to towns and did his level best to exacerbate tensions there to benefit himself. Matthew Hopkins died on the 12th of August 1647 back in Manningtree. His death was likely caused by tuberculosis. In line with common practice at the time, he was buried only a few hours after his death in the churchyard of St. Mary in Mistley. John Sterne continued their work for another year, though he proved less successful than Hopkins had, and with some semblance of order beginning to return to England following the end of the Second English Civil War in August 1648, the window for a rogue Witchfinder General to operate around the country was closing. He subsequently published his own text in 1648 to complement Hopkins' Discovery of Witches, the title of which, A Confirmation and Discovery of Witchcraft, was clearly designed to add to the arguments put forward by his colleague before his death. Collectively, their writings, along with earlier texts such as King James's Demonology, went on to influence how English men and women perceived witches, witchcraft, and the interrogation of witches down to the end of the 17th century and beyond. The irony of the story of Matthew Hopkins and his work as Witchfinder General was that by the late 1640s, the witch hunts across Europe were beginning to decline in intensity. After a peak period between 1580 and 1640, the number of people being accused and convicted of witchcraft declined markedly in the 1650s, 1660s and 1670s as the scientific revolution saw reason triumph over superstition, and as the European wars of religion, which had caused such intense religious feeling since the early 16th century also came to an end. By the time the famous Salem witch trials occurred in Massachusetts in the 13 colonies in North America in the early 1690s, the witch hunts were virtually over in Europe itself. The 1700s and 1710s saw the last official witch trials in many countries, and several countries moved in the years that followed to ban people from prosecuting people in their communities on witchcraft charges altogether. The last witch trials were held in England in Leicester in 1717, and Parliament criminalised witchcraft trials in the country in 1736. Nevertheless, throughout the second half of the 17th century and into the 18th, Matthew Hopkins' discovery of witches continued to influence how witchcraft was perceived in the country. By the time the last execution on charges of witchcraft occurred in England in 1716, over 500 people, of which more than 90% were women, had occurred in England as part of the witch hunts, though this paled in comparison to a country like the Swiss Confederacy, where approximately 10,000 were killed. Of those killed in England, most died in the politically tense period of the 1640s, and Matthew Hopkins is believed to have been involved in trials that involved upwards of 200 deaths, making him the most significant figure in the English witch craze of the early modern period. Matthew Hopkins is thought of by some as an obsessive, a figure who became convinced that he had a mission to hunt down and destroy witches in England who, in his mind and in the minds of the communities he served, posed a genuine and real threat to the souls of Christians across England and the safety of all people. Others take a different view, that Hopkins was fundamentally an unprincipled, money-driven Christian who extracted confessions from women he did not believe to be guilty of witchcraft through the use of techniques he knew would lead them to hallucinate, often in so doing, make statements which could be used in evidence against them before the court. It is important, when considering how we think about Matthew Hopkins today, that we remember that we know next to nothing about him, with the scant records we have of him relating only to the final few years of his life. His discovery of witches is one of the few major sources concerning Hopkins. It reveals a man who felt he was under scrutiny from the public and from the legal authorities in the Eastern Association on both his methods and the validity of his accusations, against which he pits often contradictory and awkward counter-arguments. We also know from this record that he was dishonest about the fees he charged and the sort of methods that he used, as well as who ordered such techniques to be deployed. Indeed, his claim that it was the courts which ordered him to undertake torture against the accused does not tally with the fact that in 1647 it was the same courts which were starting an investigation into Hopkins and Stearne for their use of illegal methods of torture. It is highly likely that Hopkins lied about being a formal Witchfinder general employed by the government, given that state records refer to him simply as a busy man rather than an official in their employ. There are no records of any official appointment or even education of Matthew Hopkins, and it instead appears that he was simply exploiting the chaotic political and social environment of the Civil War years in England to present himself as something he wasn't. This had consequences, and Hopkins' duplicity and actions led to the suffering of many people. Between 1644 and 1647, hundreds of people suffered at his hands, and many died as a result of the false indictments against them that Hopkins made possible. This was an accusation which overwhelmingly affected the poorest, most isolated and most vulnerable in a community, and regardless of whether or not Matthew Hopkins embarked on his campaign believing that it was a divine mission or simply a way to make easy money, the pain and suffering inflicted on his victims were very considerable. What do you think of Matthew Hopkins? Was his zeal driven by genuine belief or a desire to get rich quick? What do you think really lay behind the witch craze in early modern Europe? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Thank you for watching People Profiles documentaries. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notifications so you never miss an upload. If you would like to watch our videos with no adverts of any kind, listen to audio podcast versions of our videos, discuss history with other People Profiles fans, and much, much more, go to peopleprofiles.com and become a member for as little as $2 per month. Members can also receive discounted merchandise, behind-the-scenes material, and a credit in our videos, along with much more. So, please support us in our work in return for exclusive offers at peopleprofiles.com via the link in the video description. Thank you very much for watching.